So when you consider your process in meditation, what you think it is right now, hopefully, will not be what it actually is in 2 to 3 years from now. Hopefully, the realizations that you think you want to have right now will not be what your realizations actually are 10 or 20 years from now. I remember when I first became interested in this, I wanted to know what is God? What is the divine? What is this infinite consciousness? That's what I wanted to know. And I had a sense of what it was, right? Now, that sense of what it was is not actually what it is, but it gave me a direction to go in so I could figure it out for myself. So this is another part of the process that you have to be aware of. What you think it is probably not it. Because if that's what it was, you wouldn't be trying to figure it out, right? So you want to be willing to wonder, to use what you learn here this week, the philosophy that you study, the techniques that you learn. You want to have an idea of where you want to go, but then be open to see what it's really like. Okay. And this is going to be true across the board in life. For example, how many of you are married? How many of you have been married for more than 10 years? How many of you have been married for more than 20 years? 30? 40? 50? So we got one. I've heard that the first 50 years are the hardest. Is that right? Someone told me that. What's that? Yeah. I had a friend down in Asheville, and he had his 50th wedding anniversary, and on the 51st anniversary, he said to me, he's like, the first 50 years, they're the hardest. But the reason I bring that up is because, do you think that when you first got married, right, what you thought marriage was going to be like when you first got married, was it actually what it was like once you've been married for 20, 30, 40, 50 years? Someone's laughing. Yeah. Usually it's not. And why is that? Because let's say you do get married when you're in your teens or your 20s or even your early 30s. What do you know then? How do you know how to be in a relationship with someone else? Do you really know yourself, let alone do you have the capacity to know someone else? So in order to have a successful relationship, you have to be willing to learn more about yourself, and you also have to be willing to learn more about the person and how to live and grow together. And the same thing is true with the spiritual practice. In a way, you can think of it like you are a student, you are a devotee, you are a disciple. Disciple simply means student. And you have a relationship either with a guru, or you have a relationship with God, divinity, or a tradition. And a lot of the process is really learning, how do you fit into that? How does what are you, first of all, and how does that fit into the relationship with the guru? How does that fit into the relationship with the tradition? How do you fit into the relationship with God, the divine? Because if you come at your spiritual practice the same way most people come at relationships, meaning what am I going to get out of it, that's not going to be a sustainable relationship, right? So as you come into this process, absolutely you are going to benefit from meditating, you're going to benefit from studying, you're going to benefit from coming together in groups like this, you're going to benefit from spending time with your spiritual teacher, should you find one in a body. And you're going to benefit from all of that, and it's going to enlighten you. It's going to illuminate your life. But you have to remember that the other side of that is, what do you contribute to that? So when I talk about the Kriya Yoga lineage, yes, we can look at it as though the lineage of teachers, from teacher to student, but you have to remember you're part of that lineage too. The lineage is not just the individuals who are teaching, speaking. The lineage are the people who are practicing and manifesting and representing the tradition. So your life and your behavior is a representation of this tradition. And that is what is, in a sense, giving back to the tradition. And so the whole field, the field of me, you, of Roy, Mr. Davis, Paramahansa Yogananda, Sri Yukteswar, and so on, that is a field that persists through time. And when you remain engaged in that field by going through your practice, by remembering the teachings, by doing your best to live a wholesome life, then you are actually participating in a healthy spiritual relationship. And that is really what is supportive of you. Now, many of you might know, if you've listened to any of my talks, that I'm actually not a group person. I don't want people getting together in meditation groups and having coffee every Sunday and talking about their problems and so on. I want you at home meditating, getting it done, and then going out into the world and letting your light shine. That's just me. Okay, so don't think that, you actually have to listen to me in that regard. But you being by yourself, doing your practice on your own, that is still contributing to the wholeness of this field of the spiritual tradition, right? When I'm at home and I'm meditating and I have these pictures, we have these pictures, Jasmine and I have them up on our mantle, and I have a huge picture of Roy that one student painted for me in my room where I do all my videos and podcasts, and I have an icon of Shri Ishvara, and I have Anandamoy Ma over the door where I walk into the room where I do most of my work. I have books of Roy's, of Shri Ishvara's, of Shiva Puri Baba's. These things are all over the place. And every time I see them, every time I look at a picture, every time I remember the life of one of the teachers, I'm participating in that field. And this brings more light into your life. This brings more sacredness into your life. So that's one way to do it. We began this talk with a little prayer. Now, that is an altered version of a prayer that I learned from Swami, which we initially learned in Italian, but we couldn't quite figure it out, so we had it translated to English. But what I have found is that little prayer, receive, Lord, and I'll say the food part, receive, Lord, in thy light this food, for it is thine, infuse it with thy love, thy energy, and thy divine life. Well, you can do that over your food. You can do it in a gathering like this. If there's someone you love, you can say, receive, Lord, in thy light this person, infuse them with thy love, thy energy, and thy divine life. Before you go to work, receive, Lord, in thy light this work that I'm about to do, infuse it with your, and so on, right? You can use that prayer, and if you use it consistently, every little thing you do becomes illuminated. And when everything becomes illuminated, you start to see things more clearly. You become more attuned to what you could call the radiant field, as Mr. Davis would say, or the radiant field of spirit. And when you start to have that permeate your life, all of your decisions become aligned with a higher power. Now, it doesn't mean you're going to be successful all the time. It doesn't mean that things aren't going to go wrong, but it means that no matter what happens, that experience is aligned with a higher power. And in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, there are 3 pillars of Kriya Yoga. Tapas, which can loosely be translated as your spiritual practice. Svadhyaya, which is study of scriptures or study of yourself. And then Ishvara Pranidhana, which again can loosely be translated as surrender to God. And the interesting thing about Ishvara Pranidhana is that's said to be the fastest way to spiritual realization, surrender to God, the fastest way to spiritual realization and inner growth. In the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali goes through what is a state of oneness, what is a state of pure being. He gives all these ways of exploring it, of experiencing it. But he says, essentially, the fast track to doing that is through surrender to the divine. Now, surrender to the divine, you can intellectualize that. And you can just tell yourself all the time, well, I'm surrendered. I surrender this to the divine, and so on. You can get in your head and you can kind of turn it into a mental game. And that's okay, because that's a good first step, because you're starting to spiritualize your thoughts in a way. But the reason that's troublesome and sometimes difficult is because let's say you spend 10 years doing that, and on the 11th year you look around and you still don't feel like you've surrendered in God and that God is nowhere to be found, right? Well, eventually you get frustrated and you just give up. You think this whole surrender to God thing isn't all it's cracked up to be, and who knows, why did Patanjali even mention this? So we have to remember that we can use our minds in that way, but the purpose of Kriya Yoga is to actually give you a direct experience of what it's like to know God, divinity, and to feel a sense of this infinite consciousness expressing through you. Because when you catch glimpses of it, you actually see it, you actually feel it. You're not just telling yourself, you're not just, saying, my hair is braided. Oh, yep, sure is. You're not just telling yourself that, you know it. Well, then surrender to God becomes easy. And so what we're aiming to do is to make our life as sacred as possible, so that as that light shows up for us, we catch a glimpse of it, we see it, we're not playing mind games with ourselves, and we can catch it, we can remember it, we can acknowledge it, and then that starts to kind of come together to where there's one flash of light, and then maybe a year later another flash of light, and then maybe 6 months later another flash, and they keep getting spaced out in your meditation or other places until eventually it's like every other day you catch a little flash here and there. And then as that goes on, maybe a couple times a day you catch a little flash. And then as that goes on, eventually it persists longer and longer. And when you start to feel a greater sense of light and connection more consistently, you are less likely to forget that it is true. How many of you, when you're feeling good, of course you think God is real and a part of your life, right? How many of you feel that way, right? How many of you, when you're absolutely depressed and things have not been going well, you can't remember it at all? Anyone have that issue? I know I have that issue. I know. I've talked to my counselor about this. I said, why is it? Why can't I remember during those times when I'm just bottomed out that there is this sense of support and divinity? Because I sure as heck feel it other times. Why is that? Well, it's habit. It's habit. And as the years go on, eventually the situation reverses itself to where even in the difficulties, even in the times when you're just bottomed out and depressed, you know that it's just a cloud passing through your awareness. You know that it's just a moment that's going to go on, right? And one of the best ways, aside from a deep spiritual practice, to get a sense of that is just pay attention to how you think and feel over the next 2 weeks. Sometimes you're going to feel great. Sometimes you're not going to feel great. But it's always going to change. It's always going to keep cycling through. And the more you're able to be aware of that and to see that, eventually you start taking the difficulties so seriously because just wait a minute, the weather is going to change. And the more that you see that happening, the more even-minded you become, the more calm you become, the more trusting you become in the wholeness of life. And the more that builds, again, this light, the sacredness grows. And it becomes easier to meditate then. It becomes easier to understand spiritual literature. It becomes easier to listen to lectures of your spiritual role models or spiritual teachers and understand what they're talking about. And that's because this world that you're experiencing right now, the nature of it is change. It's always changing. If you can't see that, that's your first step, is to recognize that the world is changing. But there's one thing that is not changing, and that is you as spirit, as a witness, as the observer, as a presence. The trouble is that which doesn't change, that infinite self of you, you can't see it. You can't touch it. You can't taste it. You can't give any kind of characteristics to it because it is what you are. Right? It is what you are. Anything else is part of nature, is part of the world. And that's why in yoga philosophy, maybe you've heard the chant spirit and nature dancing together. Maybe we'll hear it sometime. It's one of my favorites this week. But there's spirit and there's nature, and they're both eternal. They're both eternal. And part of what we're aiming to realize in this whole process is that eternal nature of ourself, but also to have the ability to acknowledge the ever-changing experience of nature. In Sanskrit, nature is called prakriti, and the soul, or the spirit, or the undefinable you, is called purusha. So we have prakriti and purusha. And the goal of the yogi, as described in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, is to develop unceasing discrimination between those two things. Unceasing discrimination between Prakriti and Purusha, in between nature and spirit. And the interesting thing about it is, which you might have to wrestle with, but hopefully will be inspiring, is that nature, Prakriti, the ever-changing experience, which is also, in a sense, the goddess, the divine feminine, exists solely for your own illumination as spirit. Okay. So that means that this whole play of everything that changes, everything that comes and goes, all the sorrows, all the joys, you can see it, even your thoughts. So if you can think something, that means you can see it. If you can say, I love cookies, well, you are aware of that thought within your mind, which means you as the soul can experience it. So even your thoughts are part of nature. So it goes subtle. It's not just the chair. It's not just the book. It's you as a subtle being as well. But everything that you can experience exists solely for your own illumination, your own spiritual illumination. Now, again, we're not going to get into the philosophy of why do all these horrible things happen and so on, because that can go on forever and no one has ever been able to efficiently answer that question. But I'm telling you that everything that happens within your life is divine. We'll just say Divine Mother, just to keep it simple. Divine Mother providing an experience for you, saying, hey, look back to your first true love. Remember that. That's the important thing. And why is that the case? Well, it's definitely hard to swallow in certain situations, but if you are only eternal, immortal spirit, if that's what you are, if you are one with divinity, if you are one with Ishvara and so on, then that means to define yourself by anything else, to define yourself as anything else is really kind of blasphemy, right? You love your spouse, you love your children, you love your job, you love this planet, you love the butterflies, you love the trees, you love the oceans, you love having a healthy body. But if you define yourself by any of those things as solely that is you, then when it leaves, when it's over, when it changes, what are you left with? Sorrow, despair, grief. And that's not what you are, right? That's not what you are. So when we see yogis and they seem austere and they seem aloof, it's not because they're cold. It's not because they can't appreciate life. It's because they know what they're not, right? They know what they're not, and then they also know what they are. And so the whole purpose of yoga, in a way, is to figure this out, to learn this. And this is why love is one of the most important parts of the whole practice.